We're in the kind of towards the end of a series right now that goes all the way back to the fall, but we've had 3 iterations where we've looked at the person Abraham, Isaac, and now we're here looking at Jacob. And Jacob, his life was very dysfunctional, and as we come to his story this morning, it reminds me again of that time in my life when I was really into professional wrestling, okay? Every once in a while that happens. It's like a gift to me. Like there was like a 2-year stretch where, man, I was watching WCW Nitro, WWF Raw. I'd switch back and forth. Like you could watch the pay-per-view, but it was really grainy on my parents' cable. And so I never paid for it, but I always saw just enough to know what was going on. And during the middle of this season where I was into it, there was a wrestler, okay? And his name was Goldberg. I don't know, maybe some of you like, yeah, you know Goldberg, right? Like he spears you, does the suplex thing. Yeah, you know Goldberg. And Goldberg's shtick was this, is that he never lost, okay? Like he never lost. He went 173 matches without losing, and then he ends up in some pay-per-view wrestling event, and the only reason why he lost to Big Daddy Cool, which is also my nickname in high school. I gave it to myself. And he lost to Big Daddy Cool, and the only reason why he lost was because his partner came out from like under the ring or something and tased him, and he caught him when he wasn't paying attention. Fun fact about that, Nathaniel Daly knew all of that without having to look it up. I did have to look it up. And so, but it's just, he was kind of a shtick. He never really lost. And as I started thinking about Jacob, okay, where we're at in our story or in the text this morning, you could make the case that Jacob never really loses either. Now, he struggles. It's not easy, but if you think of Jacob's story up until this point, he kind of always gets what he wants. If you go back to his relationship with his brother Esau, they're kind of one of our first interactions with Jacob. He ended up getting Jacob's birthright, which is a large sum of money, and all he had to give him was a bowl of soup, which is what he wanted. He got what he wanted. You think of his relationship with his dad, Isaac, that Jacob, what he did was he dressed up like his brother, deceived him into getting the blessing from his father that was rightly his brother's. And then, think of Laban. And you could argue, well, Laban was annoying, and Jacob had to spend 20 years with Laban. But if you look at how the story ends, he gets everything he wants. He comes home wealthy, tons of spotted and speckled sheep, and he's got a family, and you can see how this family is going to become a nation. He ends up getting what he wanted. And he usually gets what he wants up to this point through manipulation and deception. And where we come this morning is Jacob's looking at a circumstance that's before him. And it's a circumstance where he realizes as much as he's deceived, as much as he's been that way, there's nothing he's going to be able to do to win this situation coming up. And it's a circumstance that we actually looked at last week with his brother Esau. Now, just to catch you up with me, like some bullet points on his story with Esau, that 20 years before Jacob was coming back, so 20 years before our text this morning, that Jacob left his family and left Esau in particular. And the reason why he left him is because Esau said, I'm tired of Jacob being the deceiver that he is. When mom and dad are dead, I'm going to kill him. And so Jacob's like, I guess I need to get out of here. And so he leaves and he comes back. And as he comes back, he's like coming back into the land, and Esau's there. And Jacob sends word to Esau, and he's like, hey, bro, I'm back. Hopefully we're cool. Sorry about all that stuff. And Esau's response to Jacob is ominous, okay? And this is how he responds in verse 6, Genesis 32, verse 6. He says, we came to your brother Esau, and he's coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him. So what Jacob is thinking, looking at this situation, is he's like, man, I got a bunch of goats, but there's no way that I'm going to win. I do not see how I am going to be able to overpower Esau and the 400 men with him. And so when our text comes this morning, Jacob's doing something that honestly I probably would want to do if I was looking at something like that in my life, which is to maybe just spend some time by myself. Look at this in Genesis 32, we pick up in verse 22. It says the same night where all of this happened, Jacob arose, took his 2 wives, his female servants, his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. And then he took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had, and Jacob was left alone. I get that. I don't know if you ever have those moments where you feel like the weight of the world's on your shoulders. When I feel like that's me and I'm there, kind of what I want is I just kind of want to be by myself. I just kind of want to think, maybe pray. I found that naps help really good in those circumstances too. I don't know what it is, but it's like I woke up. And I think that's kind of what Jacob's doing. He's like, hey, I'm going to send them aside. I'm going to be by myself. I'll be left alone. And though he has this isn't what he gets. It's kind of one of the weirdest things. Verse 24 says, and Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. What? I'm sorry. What? So Jacob's like, just maybe get alone, pray, get thinking about my thoughts, and some guy shows up and is like, you ready to wrestle? How's your double leg takedown? We're about to find out. Like that's kind of what's going on here. There's this wrestling match. And as you think about the text, okay, this is a man wrestled with them, okay? And one of the things that is really tough to know is who this man is. That honestly, there are three schools of thought, and I depending on where I'm at, like I can see any of them. Some people believe that it's Yahweh. And the reason why they will say that is because he'll talk about how he wrestled with God and he prevailed. And so some people think that, and then there's this emphasis that you'll see at the end of the text where it's like really dark. And that's kind of looking ahead to this interaction that Moses has with God, where God says, hey, if you see me, it'll consume you. And so there's this idea here that he's able to wrestle with Yahweh because it's so dark that he can't see him. So some people think that. Some people think that this man that he wrestles with is the incarnate Jesus, and that he's wrestling with Jesus, which is kind of a cool image if you think about, like, he's like, yeah, just rest. Like that's like how he shows up on the scene. Like Goldberg, I don't know, that's not right. But he shows up, and then so some people think that, and then some people believe that it's like, because you see this in the Old Testament where an angel of the Lord will show up, and it'll be like an incarnation of God, and they'll use those terms synonymously, and even kind of Hosea, in Hosea chapter 12, he alludes to that a little bit. But it's kind of just have a lot of smart people have a lot of different opinions on it, but really what matters, okay, is that Jacob struggles with the divine. That he wrestles with the divine, and in one way or another, like God is in that. And it is quite the struggle, quite the wrestling match. And you see it here in verse 25. It says this: when the man saw that he could not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket. And Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And then he said, let me go, for the day is broken. And Jacob said, I will not go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. So Jacob gets a good name and he gets a bad hip in this situation. And as this thing goes forward, you see a lot of things happening. One, it says that, if you look at verse 25, it says that the man saw he couldn't prevail against Jacob. Now, it's not because Jacob was so strong, okay? And you know that because as soon as the man touches his hip, he loses. The idea there is that Jacob was a tough fight. Kind of, you could see it this way. Maybe you're here and you like wrestle with your kids. Like you could crush them if you wanted to, I hope. Maybe not. Maybe you're like, no, you don't know my son. He's crazy. But like for them, you can. But the reason why it lasts longer is because you're letting it. You're stronger, but they're able to kind of. And so it's a little bit of that image that's going on. What they're saying is that Jacob wasn't an easy conquest. But you see like Jacob's tenacity all over this, though. It's kind of remarkable that his hip is out of socket, and he's been wrestling all night. And even though that's true, he's able to hold on and say, I need you to bless me. I mean, an all-night wrestling match would take it out of you. Just thinking of like high school wrestling, okay? That in high school wrestling, most matches are, like if they go all the way to the end, it's 3 rounds, 2 minutes each. And if you watch someone at the end of it, you're like, man, they look exhausted. So just imagine wrestling God for all evening. Like, I imagine that you're going to be pretty exhausted. And yet here you have Jacob, and he holds on. You know, and you see this, and you see you also see like God's power on display, interestingly. That you see the power of this person in one that they're able to just touch Jacob's hip and it's over. Like, that is real power. You also see the power in the name stuff. That he's like, what's your name? And Kent Hughes in his commentary, he's like, so much more is happening here than just like acquaintances. That Jacob's response in saying his name, it's like he's confessing who he is. That his name means heel grasper. And that for him to respond by saying, I am Jacob, he's saying, I'm a deceiver. I'm a supplanter. I am rightly given this name. I have cheated my brother twice. Like that, it's like a confession of what he has done. And it's as he comes to the end of himself, it's beautiful. Because as he gets to this point, what God does is he gives him a new name, which also shows God's power. It takes someone very powerful to give an adult male a new name and for that male to accept that name. That if we were to go to lunch and I were to say, from now on, you are Gerald. Or if you were a lady and I said Geraldine. Like, you're not going to walk out and be like, okay, Goeden called me Gerald. That's it. That's who I am now, I guess. I'm Gerald. No, why? Because who am I to give you a new name? And yet Jacob's like, okay. And what we'll see as the story continues to go forward is that he is Israel. It's really interesting with the name, okay, that God names, like when you think of the patriarchs, the foundational members of this Jewish faith. You got Abraham, God gave him his name. It was originally Abram, and then it became Abraham. Even Isaac, okay, that at Isaac's birth, the reason why Isaac was named Isaac is because God told Abraham to name him Isaac. And then you got Jacob, and his name is heel grasper because he was grabbing a foot on the way. So God's like, hey, if you're going to be here, I'm going to give you your name. So there's that happening as well. So there's this like naming thing. This is going on, and so as the name stuff happens, then what comes next is Jacob's like, my turn. And he says this. And Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? It would have made it really easy because then we know who he's talking to, but whatever. But then he blessed him. So you see that Jacob doesn't get the name, but he gets the blessing that he wanted. And it's interesting because like his saying like, hey, who am I? Like, Victor Hamilton says that response to Jacob, it's fascinating because they're saying, don't you already know? I touched your hip and it went out of socket. Can you not see? You just asked me to bless you. You know enough about me. Like there's some of that happening there. And so you have that, and then as the text ends, Jacob has this realization that what just happened was incredible. Look. So Jacob called the name of that place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of his thigh. That last verse there, 30, it's a little bit of kind of an add-on, but it's Moses' way of saying, this is why we don't do that. So it's like, oh, we've always wondered why we don't eat that. Well, here now you know, so that's kind of for those people in the first century. But then you look at the first part, and it's kind of interesting because it says, like, I saw God face to face. You know, and Victor Hamilton's like, okay, I don't know that anyone really saw anything. And the reason why is because there's an incredible emphasis here in the text that it's nighttime. Okay, and not only is it nighttime, but they're in like a ravine. And what Hamilton says is that would have made it even more dark. But the idea there is that we had, like, that they had like a person-to-person encounter, okay? And then it's really easy because, I don't know, naturally I think we want to put those two statements together in verse 30 where it says, for I've seen God face to face and yet my life has been delivered. And Hamilton, he's like, I don't know that those are like one idea, but they're two separate ideas. And he sees that second part, well, my life has been delivered. He sees that as what Jacob is saying, is he's like now, because what happened at the beginning? He was afraid of his brother. He was afraid of his brother and he didn't want to face him. And now at the end of the text, what he is saying is he's saying, now I can confidently face Esau. And I know that God's going to take care of me. And we'll see that in how he approaches Esau when we come back to the text, because it's different than it was when he started. So there's this confidence here, and I find it to be so beautiful because Jacob was just alone, and yet here you have God being gracious to him. So the question is, okay, so what do you do with this? Like, what do you do with this text? What does it show us? And the way I see it is this text shows us three things about God. Three things about God for us to consider this morning. And the first thing about God is this text shows us that God initiates. That he initiates. That when I think of the ending and I think of the beginning, it's really beautiful if you think about it. Because there's almost a sense of he found God when he wasn't looking for him. He went to be alone, and God showed up, and now he's able to face what's next confidently. It wasn't because of anything Jacob did. It wasn't because Jacob was so special or clever, but it was just God initiating things in a way to just show him grace. I mean, think about verse 24. He's like, he was left alone, and then a man wrestles with him. Like, Jacob wasn't like, all right, I've stretched out, I'm ready. Like, that wasn't what he was expecting. And when you think about, think about that for a second, that God initiates, that our relationship with him, he initiated it. And when I think about that, I can't help but think of dating, okay? And when you think of dating, maybe you're here and you're, you're with someone, and maybe at first, they weren't into you, but you knew, right? And so you just kept pursuing. Maybe you have a story that's similar like that, maybe, whatever. And if that's your story, it ended in one of two ways, right? It ended with a really, really touching wedding speech, or it ended with a restraining order. But either way, it ended. But even you think about that, if you've been to a wedding recently, where maybe the groom or the bride gets up and they're like, I always knew that I wanted to be with them. And though they didn't initially see it, I never gave up. I always knew, and I was always ready and available. Well, how do you feel in that moment? You're like, man, that's beautiful. How cool is it that that's what they did, that they never gave up, that they always kept pursuing? And that's exactly what God does for you. That he initiates and he continues to pursue. And if you were to think about your relationship with God, okay, think about it. Maybe some of you, you're like, I've been a Christian my whole life. Think of how beautiful that is and all the pain that you've been able to avoid by walking with him. But if you're like me, you probably haven't been. Probably the first time you heard the gospel, your response was maybe later, right? And God graciously continued to pursue you. And hear me, what does that say? How beautiful is he that he would be willing to continue to initiate, to continue to pursue, even though we say no all the time. I love the way that the New Testament writer, one of the writers in the New Testament, a man named John, he wrote a few letters, and he said this in his first letter in chapter 4. He says this, and this is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his own son to be the propitiation for our sins. Not that we loved him, that if you're here and you're following Christ, it's not because of who you are, it's not because of what you've done, it's because he loved you first. It's because he pursued you, because he went after you. And maybe you're here this morning and you're like, he's never pursued me. I just would challenge you to think of the irony of you thinking that. Because you're literally here and I'm telling you that he is. You just don't hear me. And also just think about what this means. Maybe, there's a lot of people and they just believe that they're not valuable. They believe they don't matter. They believe that no one sees them, that no one cares about them. But think about it. God initiates, that he pursues you, that he goes after you, that he wants nothing more than to know you. What does that say about your value? That he sees you as incredibly valuable, that he sees you as worth initiating. And so the first thing we see in the text is we see that he initiates. The second thing we see in the text is that he humbles. But as beautiful as the fact that he initiates is, man, he also humbles, and that's the hard part of this whole thing, right? And you see it all over. First you got this stuff with the hip, right? Hips don't lie. And so he got this situation where I think of it, on a few levels, I think it's humbling. One is, like you're Jacob, okay? You're wrestling with something that you know is divine, and you're going all night. You've got to be thinking, dude, I am tough. And then in one moment, it's over. It's like if you've ever arm wrestled someone who's really strong and you're you got him to here and you're man, look at me. And then all of a sudden they start trying and you're oh, no, never mind. That's kind of what happens. It's this awareness that no, the only reason why you're able to go so long is because I let you. But he does. He continues to go. He's no easy conquest. And then you got the thing with the hip. I think a fair question. How is it a blessing that he gets to walk the rest of his life with a limp? This isn't like today where you hop in a car and, there's all kinds of stuff. No, he ends up walking to Egypt at the end of his life with a limp. What is that? But here's what God's showing him. He's showing him that it's better that he walks with him with a limp than he walks by himself just fine. And maybe you have moments like that in your life where you look back on your history and you have maybe not a physical limp, but an emotional one. There's a part of you that's wounded, and it's hard, but as time and perspective has you've been able to see it, you see that though it wasn't what you would have ever wanted, you see the grace in it. You see that limp has caused you to trust him, that it humbled you, that it changed you in such a way that you realized how much you need him. But here you have God, he's humbling. Maybe you're here, okay, and I don't know what God's doing in your life. I have no idea. But maybe you're here and you're going through something really difficult, okay? It might be worth you praying and just saying, hey, God, are you trying to humble me with this? God, is there something here that you want me to see that I'm missing? Because this just seems harder than it should be. So are you just trying to open my eyes and allow him to show you? You have this humbling thing, and then you have this picture of Jacob, okay? And it's fascinating to me. Okay, so Jacob, at the end of the night, after all of this has happened, he's holding on and just saying bless me. And think about Jacob. Everything he's got through deception. He's been the one who's been able to make it happen. And what he is saying as he's holding on, saying, please bless me, is he's saying the only way that I get what I want is if you give it to me. There's no way that I can deceive myself into this, that this only comes as a free gift from you. That God humbled him to this place where he realized that, and that's part of experiencing Jesus. That you have to be brought to a place where you realize that there's nothing you can do to save yourself. That your only hope is that as you cry out to him, bless me, save me, and that he will. That's your only hope. There's no amount of good deeds. There's no amount of deception. There's no amount of manipulation. And what you see is that Jacob, in a way, was brought to that type of point. But it's also worth noting about humbling. Okay, so God humbles Jacob. And in the New Testament, you see this idea that not only God humbles us, but sometimes we can humble ourselves before God does. And Jesus' brother, James, he wrote a letter in our New Testament, and he says this in chapter 4. He says, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. That maybe you're here and there are just like parts of your heart that are just very, very arrogant. There are parts of your life where you're just like, humble yourself there before he does. Because I think it's better when you do. So he humbles, he initiates, and then finally you see in the text, he defines. He defines. It's just, like, it's funny. He has this wrestling match, this all-night wrestling match. And then God has the audacity in verse 27 to say, "What's your name?" And then Jacob answers, and he's like, "Not anymore. You're Israel now." Which is gotta be like, man, I just moved to this. I got to find the Social Security Administration and change that. And the DMV and Heron was a lot, like, there's like this stuff that he's like, but man, I got my name's different. But what you see what God is showing us is he's showing us he's the one that defines who we are. Not only is he showing us that he defines who we are, but we don't define who he is. And if you think about, man, our culture, don't we try to do both? No one tell me who I am, who, like, right? And you know what? That's not what God thinks. This is what God thinks, right? We do that. And here in the text, you see, there's not really room for that. And I think it's funny that we think that we can define ourselves. Because if we were to be really honest, we're wrong a lot about what we think is best for us. I mean, just like think about like all kinds of stuff. Like how many times in your life have you changed careers? Again, I bet the first one you're like, this is the one. And now you're like, this is the one. And maybe there'll be another one. And you're going to say, this is like, because you don't know. Think of the times in your life where in a moment, you're like, I know exactly what I need. I know exactly what I need to do. I know exactly what I need to do to handle this situation. And then you do it and you look back and you immediately regret it. Because you don't always know what's best for you. I mean, there are probably times in your life, right, where you're like, you thought really hard about something, you made a good plan, you really thought through all the options, and you're like, this is what I'm going to do. And then a year later, you look back and you're like, man, that was not the best decision for me. And if we are the source of defining who we are, then we're going to get it wrong. But if we're willing to let him define who we are, well, he's always going to get it right. And the way that you let him define who you are is you submit your life to him. You respond to his initiation. And then he will. Maybe you're here and you just have like some past sin stuff. And it just weighs so heavy on your heart that you're like, this is who I am. What God would say to that is, that's not who you are. I define who you are. And that's not, I see Jesus. I don't see that. But you don't have to be weighed down by those things. Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it's a thing where you're like, no, I am my career. This is it. Like, I am successful. I define who I am. And what Jesus says, he's like, no, like, maybe that's part of what's going on right now for you, but that's not, if that's what you're putting your trust in, that's very flimsy. Because not only do you not know what's best for you, you don't have as much control as you think you have either, but I control it all. Let me define who you are. And really, like, that's what happens. And part of the beauty is that Jacob allows God to say, this is who you are. And I would just point this out as I close, that maybe wrestling seems like a weird metaphor, seems like a weird example. But when you think about what he does, we kind of wrestle with him on this stuff, don't we? That when God initiates, most of the time our first response isn't yes. Most of the time our first response is no. And we wrestle. And we go back and forth, and then finally he wears us down. And no one's like humbling yourself. Yeah, we always live to sign up for that, don't we? When God does it, when he humbles us, it's like we fight it. When maybe he's trying to show us something. And gosh, when it comes to how we're defined, don't want anyone to tell us who we are. But man, when he wins, man, when we get to the end of ourselves and we realize that the only hope we have is if he blesses us, then we get something really good. I like the way that the Apostle Paul talks about this struggle. He talks about it in our New Testament. And he says this, he says, I fought the good fight. I finished the race. I've kept the faith. Henceforth, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. Not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. It's a fight. We wrestle. But at the end, we get to be with him forever. How have you responded to his initiation? When he initiates, what do you do? What do you do when he humbles? Are you willing to let him define you? Let's pray. God, we love you. We're thankful for who you are. God, we're thankful for the grace that you show us, that you give us freely. You know, even in this moment, God, I can't help but think, how cool is it that you would even interact with us? That you would take an interest in our lives even in this way. God, how cool is that? And yet you do. You know, God, I can't help but wonder, there are probably people in this room that are wrestling with you about all kinds of things. I pray, God, that you would help them. That if they need to respond to your love by putting their faith in you, I pray they would. If they need to allow themselves to be humbled, because of something I pray that they would. If they're seeking to say that I am something that you don't want them to be, I pray that you would give them grace. But God, we're thankful that we can look to you, that we can know you, that we can experience your power. And I just pray that that would transform our hearts, God. It's in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Love you guys.
Hey guys, thank you so much for joining us for Service Online today.
And if you feel called to give at New Life, there's two different ways you can do so. You can text the number 84321 with the amount that you would like to give, or you can go online to giving.nlspringfield.com.
And we would love to see you here at New Life in person sometime. And when you're here in person, the best way to connect with us is at Party with the Pastor. It is the first Sunday of every month, and it is a party. We've got games, snacks, giveaways, and you'll get to know New Life just a little bit better.
We would love to see you in person. We have services at 8, 9:30, and 11. We would love it if you would join us.